They thought they had me cornered, Mom, Dad, and my perfect sister Sarah, all smugly waiting for me to squirm, but their faces absolutely drained of color the second I slid the official deed across the distressed farmhouse table and announced that rent was now $18,000. It was Thanksgiving dinner, and the air, thick with the scent of sage stuffing and cheap Pinot Grigio, suddenly tasted like pure distilled venom. For years, Amelia Reed had been the family punching bag, the quiet failure, the black sheep who just wouldn't leave. And for years, I'd been waiting for the perfect moment to return the favor, not with tears or anger, but with the cold, unassailable power of high finance. The setting was our traditional annual feast in the affluent suburbs of Chicago, a carefully curated tableau of upper-middle-class American success designed to celebrate everyone but me. The centerpiece, a 20-pound bronze turkey, felt less like a meal and more like a sacrificial offering to the altar of the Reed family's self-image. My mother, Carol, a woman whose entire personality was built around passive aggression, judging her own children and ensuring the napery was perfectly starched, sat at the head of the table radiating self-satisfaction. Next to her was my father, James, a man whose spine had long ago dissolved under Mom's constant pressure content to signal his agreement with a small, enabling nod. James was the sort of man who believed that quiet deference equated to domestic peace, failing to realize he was merely funding a hostile internal environment. And then there was Sarah, my younger sister, the golden child currently glowing with the reflected success of her new fiancé, Michael. Sarah had been planning her life since she was 10 years old to involve minimal effort and maximum reward, a goal her parents had aggressively funded. Michael, a smarmy venture capitalist from Boston who specialized in disrupting things that didn't need disrupting, was the catalyst for the evening's drama. He was the kind of guy who thought asking invasive, rude questions was just good networking and mistook cruelty for candor. He'd spent the entire dinner before the main event subtly belittling my past career choices, referring to my switch from a major Wall Street firm to consulting as a soft landing. We were mid-turkey, having just navigated a tense discussion about the current market volatility, a topic I was intimately familiar with, but was politely excluded from. Sarah had just finished a lengthy self-congratulatory monologue about her upcoming Napa Valley destination wedding, focusing heavily on the custom floral arrangements and the exclusive winery she'd secured. Everyone, Dad, Mom, and the two distant, usually silent cousins from out of state oohed and awed on cue. The cousins, David and Laura, looked deeply uncomfortable, perhaps sensing the electric undercurrent of hostility that always defined Reed family gatherings. When the silence finally fell, Michael leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his eyes fixed on me with that condescending pity I'd grown to hate, like I was a distressed asset he was considering acquiring for pennies on the dollar. "So, Amelia?" he asked, his voice booming slightly in the overly quiet dining room, relishing the sound of his own authority. He didn't use my nickname Amy because he wanted to make it sound official, like he was delivering a corporate review designed to make me squirm. "Sarah tells me you're still crashing with your parents. That's gotta be tough, right? At 32, trying to find your footing in this market, especially after giving up those big San Francisco bonuses. How long are you planning to stay in the guest house? Are you setting a timeline for re-entry?" The question was a direct hit, a perfectly timed piece of public humiliation designed to establish his superiority and my diminished status. I had moved back to the Chicago area 2 months ago, ostensibly to take a break from my high-pressure job at Ethel Capital in San Francisco, but really to execute the final lethal stage of my plan. I had been staying in the detached guest cottage on the property, which they constantly referred to as my childhood bedroom, knowing full well the sting it carried. My father winced slightly, a fleeting moment of decency that evaporated instantly when Mom's voice sliced through the tension. "Lie, Amelia. Don't sound pathetic." Mom snapped, her tone low and vicious, directed solely at me but audible enough for Michael and the cousins to catch. She didn't even look at me. She was busy flicking a minute crumb of artisanal cornbread off the pristine tablecloth. Her command wasn't advice. It was a cruel public statement of fact. Your truth is an embarrassment to this family. You are a defective product. Sarah, God bless her entitled heart, didn't even try to hide her delight. Her blue eyes sparkled with malicious pleasure. She threw her head back and let out a sharp, cackling laugh that was somehow worse than Mom's direct insult, lacking all warmth or remorse. Oh, Amy, just invent something. Say you're between two massive hedge fund deals, or that you're house-sitting a penthouse in Miami while the owner sails the Mediterranean. No one here will know the difference, darling. Just own the narrative. The air crystallized. Every eye was on me, waiting for the expected reaction. The tight, embarrassed smile, the mumbled excuse about saving up, the swift retreat to the kitchen to check on the pie, the usual defense mechanisms of the perpetual underdog. That was the Amelia they knew, the compliant, wounded one who always internalized their scorn. But that Amelia was long gone. Over the last 3 years, I had learned a truth as solid as the foundation of the house we sat in. You cannot reason with systematic generational cruelty. You can only counter it with overwhelming, irrefutable financial force. I paused, chewing slowly on a piece of turkey, letting the silence stretch until it was nearly unbearable. I met Michael's expectant gaze, then Sarah's triumphant one, and finally Mom's, which was already back on her plate, having dismissed me as unworthy of her sustained attention. It's actually much simpler than that, Michael, I said, my voice measured and calm, a smooth baritone cutting through the anxiety. My inner thermometer, which usually spiked to boiling at such public slights, was reading a cool, refreshing 0. I felt strangely weightless, observing the scene as if I were reviewing a poorly executed theatrical performance. I am indeed crashing here. The reason is logistics, pure and simple, and I believe in maximizing efficiency for all my assets. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer, a garment Mom had already silently critiqued for being too severe and not feminine enough, and pulled out a long, legal-sized envelope. It was crisp white and possessed a satisfying heavy weight, the weight of certified truth. The quiet click of the envelope hitting the table made everyone flinch, their collective attention snapping to the plain white paper. I slid the folded document out and across the table, aiming it directly at my mother's water glass. The heavy, embossed paper stamped with the seal of the Cook County Recorder of Deeds stopped just short of the rim. See, I'm not exactly crashing here because I'm destitute. I continued, my eyes never leaving Mom's face as she finally reluctantly looked up, her expression shifting from bored annoyance to mild, irritated confusion. I'm crashing here because it is now my principal residence. I bought it. Michael snorted, thinking I was going with Sarah's lame invent something suggestion. He was a creature of predictable narratives. A joke, right? You bought a house in this zip code on a 2-month career break. These properties go for $4 million cash only. Come on, Amelia, stop pretending. I gave him a small, precise smile, the kind I reserved for clients who underestimated my due diligence. Not a joke, Michael. Read the bottom line, Mom. It's an all-cash transaction. Closed 30 days ago, discreetly through a holding company you wouldn't recognize. We needed the speed and the anonymity for a smooth asset transfer. Mom Carol, the woman who never lost control, actually reached for the paper, her manicured fingers trembling slightly. Sarah, leaning over her shoulder like a vulture, peered down, her triumphant smile evaporating instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, ugly disbelief. The deed was clearly addressed to Emerald Holdings LLC, my wholly owned investment vehicle. The property address was starkly listed 4125 Cedar Lane, the very house we were currently sitting in. Below it was the purchase amount, explicitly detailed $3.8 million. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room, leaving everyone breathless and exposed. Dad looked like he'd been hit by a truck driving a foreclosure notice. Sarah looked like she was about to cry or scream or accuse me of witchcraft, a genuine meltdown. Mom, however, had the most beautiful, nuanced reaction, pure, unadulterated shock, dissolving instantly into a cold, calculating fury. She was already mentally constructing her defense. "This is a forgery." "Amelia," she hissed, her voice barely a whisper, yet radiating panic and a desperate need to reclaim authority. "A cheap parlor trick, a piece of printed novelty paper. This house belongs to the Reed family trust. Our lawyer explicitly protected it." "Did belong," I corrected gently, picking up my fork to finish the last bite of sweet potato casserole. Savoring the flavor and the moment equally, the Reed family trust had some serious, undisclosed financial liabilities related to Dad's struggling metal fabrication business. Reed Fabtech, remember, big commercial debt, the kind that prioritizes creditors over emotional attachments. When the primary debt holder called the note the trust's primary asset, this property was quietly liquidated 3 months ago to cover the shortfall and avoid a messy public bankruptcy. I was the buyer acting as the ultimate creditor. It's all legal, Mom. I'm an expert in corporate debt restructuring and distressed asset acquisition. Remember, I just restructured our family's debt by purchasing the collateral. I placed the fork down with a definitive clink that sounded like a gavel hitting a block. So yes, I'm crashing with my parents. I'm crashing with my tenants. And since you failed to honor the verbal lease agreement you've been operating under for the last 30 years, and since Thanksgiving seems like the perfect time to review financials, I slid the new lease agreement across too. It specifies $18,000 per month, paid on the 1st. Late fees are non-negotiable, if you beg. I didn't need to say another word. The truth of the transaction, the cold, undeniable power of the notarized county-stamped paperwork spoke for itself. Michael, the smug venture capitalist, choked violently on his water, realizing he was sitting next to a woman who was financially lethal. Sarah whimpered, her perfect manicure digging into her mother's shoulder. And Mom Carol finally looked at me, her eyes filled not with contempt but with something terrifyingly close to raw animal fear and respect for my power. She knew I had the upper hand, and she knew I had not just money, but cold, hard legal dominion. The game of family favoritism was officially over, and I had just gotten the last, most satisfying laugh. That was the moment that changed everything. But the truth was that moment had been 2 decades in the making. The development, the backstory, and the meticulous planning that led to that moment had been a secret, solitary endeavor, a decade-long exercise in delayed gratification and silent financial warfare. The seed of that cold revenge was planted long before Michael's cruel question or Mom's vicious demand to lie. It started with a lifetime of subtle, poisonous favoritism that made me feel less like a beloved daughter and more like an uninvited, highly competent intruder in my own life. I was born 3 years before Sarah, but I was always treated like the understudy, the underperforming sidekick in the Sarah Reed show. Sarah was the beautiful artistic one, the delicate flower, whose emotional stability was always the family's priority. I was the smart, practical one, the Rocky, whose emotional needs were simply dismissed as unnecessary. Sarah was showered with lavish praise for drawing a crooked dog or deciding to try pottery for a week. I was met with a curt nod and a condescending observation for graduating high school a year early and securing a full academic scholarship to the University of Chicago before transferring to Wharton. My parents, Carol and James, practiced a specific insidious brand of American parental bias, the kind that elevates one child's trivial achievements to legendary status, while dismissing the other's genuine sacrifices and monumental efforts as mere obligations. The distinction was never clearer than when it came to education funding. When Sarah decided she needed to attend a small, ridiculously expensive private arts college in Rhode Island, my parents financed the entire 4 years with zero debt, proclaiming it an essential investment in her unique vision and creative spirit. The tuition alone was enough to buy a nice starter home in a major city. When I was accepted into the prestigious Wharton School for Finance, the most practical high-earning field possible, my father James informed me with a deep sigh and a look of genuine regret that the family's liquid assets were temporarily tied up in his small, struggling metal fabrication business, Reed Fabtech. "You're the smart one, Amy," he'd told me in the kitchen that morning over stale coffee, deliberately avoiding eye contact. "You'll figure it out. Sarah needs the support more. Her spirit is so delicate. She can't handle the pressure of debt or working a job. She needs the freedom to create. I nodded, swallowing the bitterness that tasted like burnt coffee and regret. I took out massive student loans, the kind that follow you like a shadow for decades, and worked 3 jobs: bartending, tutoring, and research assistants. I sometimes pulled all-nighters just to make my tuition payments, surviving on caffeine and sheer stubborn spite. I graduated summa cum laude, not because of their support, but in spite of their calculated neglect. Meanwhile, Sarah dropped out of college after 2 years, decided she wanted to be an influencer and lifestyle guru, and moved back home, where she lived rent-free in a fully renovated wing of the house, while Dad kept funneling Reed Fab Tech funds into her lifestyle brand and content creation studio. That moment, that blatant dismissal of my relentless hard work and the elevation of Sarah's entitled whim, was the first domino. The moment the child in me died and the financial predator was born. I entered the finance world with a chip on my shoulder the size of the Empire State Building. I moved to New York and joined a boutique investment bank specializing in distressed asset acquisition and debt restructuring. My specialty was finding the deep, dark financial secrets of small to mid-size family companies and either turning them around or liquidating them for maximum value. It was a perfect fit for a woman who knew exactly what it felt like to be a depreciating, undervalued asset in a deeply flawed family portfolio. I became masterful at identifying the scent of financial fraud and emotional leverage. Over the next 5 years, I worked myself into the ground, a familiar feeling of perpetual exertion. I rarely came home. My only contact was the bi-monthly obligatory phone call where Mom would spend 30 minutes bragging about Sarah's latest sponsorship deal, usually for something utterly useless like a premium dog leash or an expensive face mask, before ending the call with a familiar cutting reminder. "You should really think about finding a nice established man, Amelia. That finance job is going to age you out of the marriage market, and you don't want to end up alone living in a tiny New York box." But the real soul-crushing and ultimately activating betrayal happened 3 years ago, just after I took a major promotion at a Silicon Valley firm, Ethel Capital, specializing in corporate forensic analysis. My expertise wasn't just in crunching numbers. It was in forensic accounting, the ability to trace money trails across multiple shell corporations and identify hidden liabilities and fraudulent transfers. One weekend, bored and feeling restless, I decided to run a pro bono quick diagnostic on Reed Fab Tech, just to see if Dad was managing things as poorly as he claimed. I accessed his company's financials, all perfectly legal since I had been a nominal non-executive partner in the business paperwork from an early age, a detail Dad had forgotten and never bothered to remove. What I found wasn't just mismanagement, it was malice perfectly tailored to ensure my permanent and absolute exclusion. Dad hadn't just not supported my education. He and Mom had established a complex, almost Baroque financial maneuver 10 years prior, timed precisely when I left for college. They had taken out a massive 7-figure second mortgage on the Chicago house, the very house we were currently sitting in, and used the capital to acquire a controlling stake in a shell company, Golden Willow Group. This group, I soon discovered through tracing the IP addresses of the incorporating attorney, was set up to manage a private, irrevocable trust exclusively for Sarah, funding her lifestyle, her early retirement, and her future wedding. The house, 4,125 Cedar Lane, was formally transferred out of the fragile Reed family trust and into a highly restrictive holding company called the Lakeview Asset Trust, a move designed to shield it from Reed Fab Tech bankruptcy, but also to ensure that the ownership structure was too convoluted for me, the smart daughter, to ever contest in a simple will challenge. I, meanwhile, was specifically listed in the trust as receiving a single symbolic and utterly worthless asset, a vintage silver tea set that Carol hated. The worst part wasn't the theft of my potential inheritance. It was the chilling, cold-blooded calculation. The archived documents and discovery emails contained exchanges between my parents and their expensive, unscrupulous lawyer, detailing their shared, explicit goal. Ensure Amelia is financially self-sufficient, but does not under any circumstances burden Sarah's inheritance. Keep the assets complex enough that she cannot easily trace them should she ever become curious. They viewed my intelligence not as a gift but as a threat that needed to be mitigated. That was it. I wasn't just the less loved child, I was a calculated financial risk to be systematically isolated, mitigated, and dismissed. They didn't just love Sarah more. They had systematically weaponized their own wealth and my father's failing business to create a financial moat around her, while deliberately leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back and my enormous student debt. That discovery, made alone in my tiny, overpriced San Francisco apartment, while the city lights twinkled outside, didn't make me cry. It made me feel nothing at all, which was far more terrifying. Then the numbness gave way to a cold, focused rage. It was the moment I stopped hoping for their love and started planning their complete financial dismantling. My goal was no longer reconciliation, it was acquisition and control. I immediately resigned from Ethel Capital, not with a bang, but with a silent ironclad non-compete clause and a massive payout from accumulated stock options and bonuses. I used that capital to establish my own private equity firm, Emerald Holdings LLC, specializing in exactly what my family was about to face: strategic acquisitions of deeply distressed assets and subsequent restructuring. My first and only client was myself, and the target asset was the Reed family's stability. I needed money, immense money, and I needed legal firepower that outmatched my parents' local suburban council. I reached out to the one person in my life who was purely meritocratic and devoid of sentiment. Emma Johnson, my former managing director at the investment bank, now the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar AI solutions firm in Seattle. Emma, a fierce, no-nonsense woman who had mentored me because I was simply the best analyst she'd ever seen, agreed to back me. Not as a friend, but as a strategic, silent partner, investing millions in Emerald Holdings for a massive equity stake. She didn't care about my family drama. She cared only about the potential return on investment and the ruthlessness of my plan. Emma had sat over a secure video line, leaning back in her Aran chair in her ridiculously large corner office overlooking Puget Sound. You want to buy your parents' house and make them pay you rent. That's petty. That's low-stakes emotional revenge. I'll back you because you're brilliant, but you need to think bigger. You need to dismantle the entire structural edifice of inequity they built. You need to own the entire narrative of their failure. She was right. I wasn't just after the house. I was after the total, irrefutable closure that only absolute financial dominance could provide. I was after justice defined by me. The plan I devised was complex and beautiful, in its ruthlessness, a perfect mesh of corporate finance, legal loophole exploitation, and emotional retribution. Phase 1. The financial trap. Acquiring the business debt. Reed Fabtech was dying, propped up by high-interest loans and a substantial unsecured line of credit, secured by a few of Dad's personal assets. Crucially, it had several tranches of low-priority commercial debt. I didn't want the business. I wanted the leverage. I used Emerald Holdings to quietly, over the course of 2 years, purchase the senior most demanding portion of Reed Fabtech's commercial debt from a series of regional banks in Texas and the Midwest. I focused specifically on the debt with the tightest covenants and the most aggressive penalty clauses. I made the purchases through blind trusts and layer upon layer of shell companies, including a seemingly benign one incorporated in Delaware called North Star Capital, ensuring the paper trail led nowhere identifiable back to Amelia Reed. My family, being financially incompetent and arrogantly convinced of their security, never checked the provenance of the debt. They just saw the name of the new debt servicing company and kept paying the minimums, oblivious to the fact that their creditor was their most wronged child. Phase 2. The property acquisition, forcing the sale. The Chicago house, 4,125 Cedar Lane, was held by the Lakeview Asset Trust. The trust had a substantial but complicated mortgage tied to the initial fraudulent maneuver, the money they used to fund Sarah's trust. I waited until the trust missed a specific high-stakes balloon payment on their mortgage, a payment I knew they'd miss because I had strategically manipulated the due date and interest rate through the debt I now controlled in Phase 1. The moment they defaulted, I exercised a specific brutal clause in the senior commercial debt agreement. I had purchased the right to call in the secured collateral upon any significant default in an associated financial instrument, which the house mortgage was deemed to be. The collateral was the house. I initiated a forced rapid sale of the house back into the trust, then simultaneously executed an all-cash purchase from the trust, using the money from Emerald Holdings Emma's money, my power. This move neutralized the mortgage and transferred the deed to my holding company in a single unassailable sequence. I had the closing expedited by a premier firm in downtown Chicago, Sullivan & Associates, which specialized in lightning-fast high-net-worth real estate transactions. They never knew they were facilitating a daughter's revenge. I even instructed them to use a notary named Linda Chen, a childhood friend, who had seen firsthand the casual, persistent abuse I suffered, ensuring the paperwork was airtight, discreet, and had one witness who understood the sheer poetic justice of the transaction. The whole thing took 3 months of intense legal and financial maneuvering to finalize. I closed on the property exactly 1 week before Thanksgiving, ensuring I would be the legal owner while sitting at their dinner table. I didn't tell my parents I was coming home to execute a plan. I told them I was coming home because I was down on my luck and needed a break, fulfilling their narrative of my failure and ensuring I'd be present for maximum humiliation. I remember the day I called Linda the notary and my friend who had reviewed the entire convoluted transaction, her jaw dropping. She was in her sleek high-rise office in downtown Chicago, a testament to her own hard work. "Amy, this is beyond genius," Linda said, her voice full of impressed disbelief. "You used their financial arrogance, their certainty that you'd never look to buy their house and become their landlord. You've literally leveraged the Reed family's bad debt and emotional cruelty into your own $4 million asset. They were playing checkers, and you were running a high-frequency trading algorithm on their lives. They taught me everything I know about ruthless acquisition, Linda," I replied, staring out at the San Francisco skyline one last time before packing my bags for Chicago. "I just learned to do it better, and with better lawyers. They were too cheap and too arrogant to hire forensic accountants. That was their fatal flaw." That brought me to the Thanksgiving dinner. The perfect captive audience gathered under the roof that was now legally mine. The golden moment when Michael, the self-appointed gatekeeper of success, prompted my mother to unleash her most venomous public slight. The aftermath of my revelation was immediate chaos, the atmosphere shifting from festive to funereal in seconds. Dad James looked pale and sickly, trying to mumble something about a lawyer, his glasses fogging slightly from the sudden heat of his panic. He knew I was smarter than his local suburban attorney. He knew I wouldn't have pulled this stunt unless the paperwork was flawless. He also knew I was the only one who truly understood the complex, fragile debt structure of Reed FabTech. Sarah, realizing that her perfect destination wedding, her trust fund, and her luxurious lifestyle were suddenly dependent on the continued solvency of the family's assets I now controlled, was the first to lash out with true venom. "You selfish, calculating bitch," she screamed, tearing the deed from Mom's grasp and throwing it back at me. It slid under the mashed potatoes, a symbol of their ruined feast. "You let us think we were fine. You let Mom remodel the master bath with the expensive Italian tile. You knew we were planning Michael's parents' visit for Christmas. You are actively destroying my wedding." I calmly retrieved the deed using a freshly folded napkin to wipe off the gravy smear. I had no legal obligation to inform my tenants of the change in ownership, Sarah. The terms of the lease require you to maintain the property, including any subsequent renovations. And as for Michael's parents, I'm sure they'll find the process of securing a new, much more expensive lease agreement very educational. Or perhaps you can host them at your condo in Napa Valley. Oh wait, that's just a fantasy. Michael was past speechlessness, his face a roadmap of confusion and dawning horror. He wasn't upset about the family drama. He was calculating the sudden, massive, irreversible drop in Sarah's net worth and the potential social fallout on his own reputation. His eyes flickered between the deed and Sarah's red tear-streaked face. His venture capitalist mind was running the numbers $18,000 a month in rent. That was $216,000 a year. Far more than my father, whose business was now clearly on the verge of total collapse under my control, could afford. This wasn't just revenge. This was a comprehensive, targeted financial execution. Mom Carol finally found her voice, hardening her expression into one of cold accusation, trying one last time to use emotional leverage. "This is monstrous, Amelia. After everything we've done for you, you are destroying your father's business. You are destroying Sarah's future. This is the highest form of betrayal." "Oh, Mom, you shouldn't use such dramatic language," I said, finally lifting my gaze to meet hers. The steel in my eyes unwavering. "Destroying Sarah's future was your job, and you managed that just fine by raising her to be completely dependent, financially illiterate, and emotionally fragile. As for Dad's business, Reed Fab Tech was destroying itself with years of sloppy accounting and unnecessary debt. I merely accelerated the inevitable and ensured the collateral ended up with a reliable owner." "And what exactly did you do for me?" "Mom, you taught me to be resourceful. You taught me that family loyalty is a myth, a liability, and that the only true power is financial control." I was listening very closely. I pushed back from the table, my tailor-made blazer now splattered with a tiny bit of cranberry sauce, feeling less like a piece of clothing and more like a suit of corporate armor. I grabbed my purse, which contained not makeup but a second copy of the eviction notice. "You've all been served," I stated, nodding toward the deed and the rent agreement. "The lease is month-to-month effective immediately. I expect the first $18,000 installment plus a penalty for the emotional distress you caused me this evening within 7 days. Late fees apply. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. I'll be in the guest house reviewing the fine print of the rest of the Reed Family Trust documents. Good luck with the new budget." I walked out of that dining room, leaving behind a scene of absolute devastation. A ruined Thanksgiving dinner, a shattered sense of entitlement, and a family that had finally terrifyingly realized they had messed with the wrong daughter. The door of the guest house clicked shut behind me, and I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The air here was cleaner, less poisoned by their self-righteousness. But the house, my house now, was just the beginning. The eviction notice was just the first domino. The real reckoning was about to begin. The next morning, I woke up in the master suite of the guest house, which was now legally mine, to the sound of frantic activity coming from the main house. Doors slammed, voices rose and fell in panicked, desperate tones. I knew they were calling their local lawyer, Mr. Peterson, trying to find a loophole, a flaw in the paperwork. They would spend thousands on retainer fees only to confirm what I already knew: I was legally, irrevocably in the right. I didn't wait for them to contact me. I was proactive, a lesson learned early in the cutthroat New York financial world. I called my lead attorney, Mark Sullivan from Sullivan & Associates, and instructed him to send a formal cease and desist letter to my father's attorney, informing them that any attempt to restructure Reed Fabtech's commercial debt without my express consent, as the primary secured debt holder, would result in immediate foreclosure, the public liquidation of all assets, and the immediate public reporting of their questionable accounting practices, specifically the inter-entity transfers to Golden Willow Group to the IRS and SEC. It wasn't entirely a bluff. I had the documentation ready. The potential for a federal investigation into James Reed's business practices, which could involve tax fraud and misappropriation of corporate funds, was the true lethal leverage. My father, James, had a debilitating habit of cutting corners. Over the years, he'd used Reed Fab Tech as his personal ATM, shuffling funds between the business and personal accounts, the very practice he used to fund Sarah's trust. I had copies of all the supporting documentation meticulously compiled by Emerald Holdings' forensic team, dated emails, ledger entries, wire transfer records. I hadn't filed anything yet, but the mere threat coming from a firm like Sullivan's was enough to freeze him in place, terrified of the consequences. Later that afternoon, Mom Carol came storming into the guest house. She didn't knock. The door burst open and she stood there perfectly coiffed, dressed in expensive athleisure wear that screamed affluent distress, but with a wild desperation in her eyes that was utterly foreign and intensely satisfying. She tried to maintain her regal posture, but the edges were frayed. "Amelia, this is absurd, illegal, and frankly completely unchristian." She began trying to summon her usual imperious tone, but it cracked pitifully on the word absurd. "We are your family. You can't legally evict us. This is emotional distress. I will sue you for everything you have, and I will make sure the entire city knows what a monster you are." I was sitting at the writing desk, my laptop open, reviewing financial models for a new, exciting investment opportunity, a small sustainable tech startup in Austin. I didn't look up immediately. I let her stand there fuming, waiting for my attention like a supplicant. I finished making a note on a financial projection before finally meeting her gaze. "You should talk to Mark Sullivan, Mom." I said, my voice level and neutral. "He's handling my legal matters and he charges by the hour, so make your questions succinct. And you should know, a lawsuit for emotional distress requires a history of emotional distress. A jury would be very interested in hearing detailed testimony about why a 32-year-old Yale graduate who put herself through school, paid off her own massive loans, and worked herself into a senior executive position at a Silicon Valley firm was constantly described by her mother as pathetic and a burden. We can also discuss the emotional toll of discovering your parents systematically excluded you from the family assets to benefit your unemployed sister using fraudulent accounting practices to do so. I think a jury might find my documented distress slightly more compelling than your current inconvenience." I closed the laptop with a decisive snap and gave her my full attention. "You see, I didn't just buy the house, Mom. I bought the evidence trail. I have all the emails detailing your plans to cut me out of the trust 10 years ago, written by your own attorney. I have the receipts for all the funds transferred from Reed Fabtech to Sarah's influencer account money that was falsely categorized as business consulting expenses to avoid paying taxes. You didn't just emotionally discriminate against me, you committed demonstrable financial fraud. And you did it all while demanding I lie. Don't sound pathetic. I chose to show you what pathetic really looks like when it gets a multi-million-dollar war chest and the expertise to dismantle your entire life structure." The color drained from her face again, pooling at the edges of her perfectly applied foundation. She had always thought her cruelty was hidden behind the impenetrable veil of family privacy and their trusted mediocre attorney. She never imagined I would have the patience, the skill, or the astronomical resources to unravel her decade-long complex scheme. She had underestimated the daughter who had to fight for everything. "We did it for Sarah. She's fragile. She can't handle the pressure of the real world like you can, Amelia. You're strong. You don't need the money. You're a success." She cried, the last vestige of her composure dissolving into genuine, terrified hysteria. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. "And that," I said, standing up and purposefully walking closer, towering over her, "not physically but in sheer force of conviction, is the core of your unforgivable sin. You mistook my strength for the ability to perpetually absorb cruelty without complaint. I am strong because I survived you. I am successful because your neglect forced me to work twice as hard as Sarah ever had to. And now I'm strong enough to ensure you face consequences that are proportionate to your actions. Consider the $18,000 rent a necessary life lesson on the American principle of liability and consequence, Carol. You supplied the motive and the mechanism for fraud. I now demand the payment. I suggest you start packing." She left in a defeated huff, promising retribution she knew she couldn't deliver, stumbling on the welcome mat. I knew I had broken her. The threat of public exposure, the thought of their affluent Chicago social circle learning that James Reed was under investigation by the IRS, and that Carol Reed had spent a decade cruelly engineering her daughter's financial ruin, was a fate worse than poverty for them. They valued reputation above all else. My real support system during this entire ordeal had been Emma Johnson. I called her that evening, catching her in London after she had just closed a major M&A deal. The first installment of the 18,000 was due at midnight, I told her, looking at my clock which ticked past the hour. No payment, just a desperate, rambling legal threat. Emma laughed, a sharp, clear sound that always cut through the clutter. Predictable. They're running a playbook from a B-grade 1980s movie. You're running a modern acquisition strategy. What's the next move? Eviction. Eviction is filed, I confirmed. But as you suggested, the house is just the symbol. The business is the true weapon. If Reed Fabtech collapses, James loses his last shred of relevance, and the money stream supporting Sarah's lavish life completely dries up. I need to ensure they lose their standing in the community, not just their address. Public humiliation is the only currency they value above money. Emma was right. My parents lived and breathed for appearances. They were obsessed with their image at the country club, their generous but highly publicized donations to the local symphony, and their perfect nuclear family facade. I had to use this intense vulnerability. I had to call them out in the most visible public forum possible. I contacted Linda, my notary friend and lawyer, and asked her to start the formal eviction proceedings, citing non-payment of rent, and to prepare a highly detailed, legally defensible affidavit summarizing the history of the Reed family trust and my parents' documented financial fraud. I instructed her to stamp it private and confidential for attorney eyes only. What are you going to do with this? Amy Linda asked, her voice cautious, sensing the escalating drama. I'm going to make sure the right people read it, Linda, and I replied. The people who hate them and the people who judge them. My revenge was entering phase 3, the public reckoning. The deadline for the first rent installment came and went without a whisper of payment. Instead, James's sweaty, nervous lawyer, Meister Peterson, sent a pathetic, strongly worded letter threatening a countersuit for undue duress and coercion. I forwarded the letter to Mark Sullivan, who promptly filed the official unyielding eviction notice with the Cook County Sheriff's Office confirming their 2-week deadline. But the real show was about to happen. The next major event on the Reed family's social calendar was the annual Chicago Charity Gala, a massive, high-profile black tie fundraising event held at the historic Palmer House Hilton downtown, attended by all the city's old money corporate elite and social gatekeepers. My parents, James and Carol, had always been minor but visible attendees, using the event to network boost James's failing business and, of course, boast incessantly about Sarah. I had never attended. Now I decided I would make my debut not as a social climber but as a financial force. I had Emerald Holdings sponsor a table. Not just any table, the table directly adjacent to the main stage, right next to the event's co-chair, a powerful real estate mogul named Richard Thompson, whom Emma knew personally and had vouched for me with. My ticket cost was astronomical, designed to send an immediate, visible message of my new net worth and influence. My arrival at the gala was designed for maximum impact. I didn't arrive alone. I arrived with Emma Johnson, flown in from London specifically for the evening, and Mark Sullivan, my imposing 6'5" lawyer. Emma in a stunning emerald green gown that matched my firm's logo, and I in a sleek custom black sheath looked like a hostile takeover team moving through the crowd with precision and purpose. My parents were already there, seated at a back corner table, looking tense, frail, and utterly out of their depth. They had already heard rumors about the house situation. The whispers travel fast in that world. They saw me and Emma glide past, nodding cordially to the city's elite, the silent, high-level confirmation that my break wasn't a failure, but a calculated, spectacular power play. James, desperate to salvage his reputation, approached me during the cocktail hour, his face gray with fear and exhaustion. "Amelia, please. We can talk about this like rational adults. The eviction? The debt? It's tearing the family apart. Think of your mother, your sister. We can find a way to make this work." "The family was torn apart 10 years ago, Dad," I said, accepting a flute of champagne from a passing waiter, taking my time to meet his gaze. "You just didn't realize it until I sent you the invoice. The moment you chose to fund Sarah's fake career with corporate assets that should have funded my education, you declared financial war. Speaking of which, the sheriff's office has confirmed your eviction date. You have 2 weeks. You might want to consider putting your furniture in storage. But Sarah's wedding. We can't plan a Napa Valley wedding without liquid funds. We need the house for collateral. He pleaded, his veneer of control completely gone, replaced by naked desperation. The same Sarah whose trust fund you spent 10 years ensuring was protected at my expense. I asked, arching an eyebrow and taking a slow sip of champagne. That Sarah. It seems a bit rich, Dad. You taught me the rules of the game. Protect your assets. I'm just playing by the rules you wrote, only I'm playing with a significantly higher balance sheet. I turned my back on him and rejoined Emma at the table, discussing leveraged buyouts loud enough for the tables around us to catch snippets of the conversation. Later, during the main charity auction, the high point of the evening, Carol, desperate to re-establish their solvency and social standing, bid an outrageous sum on a piece of mediocre modern art by a local overhyped artist. When the auctioneer called her bid, she smiled triumphantly, looking around the room for validation, trying to recapture the feeling of being in control. The auctioneer called sold to Mrs. Carol Reed for $40,000. Just as the applause began, I raised my paddle, a simple gesture that brought the room to a hush. I offer $60,000, I stated, my voice ringing clearly through the ballroom's sound system. Carol's head snapped toward me, her eyes wide with initial disbelief which quickly morphed into cold, ugly fury. I was now in a public, humiliating bidding war with my own mother. She raised her paddle instantly. $75,000. $100,000, I said without hesitation, my face impassive. She hesitated, her face pale. She knew James didn't have liquid funds. She was trying to finance the art piece with a promise, a line of credit she couldn't secure. She was running on pure spite. Amelia, stop it. What are you doing? James whispered, lunging forward, but Emma placed a firm, restraining hand on his arm, her eyes daring him to escalate the confrontation. Carol, blinded by rage and the desperate need to win this tiny final battle of wills, cried out, $150,000. I smiled, a cold, predatory smile that felt utterly foreign and absolutely right. I deliberately lowered my paddle and held it down. My apologies to the auctioneer, I announced loud enough for the tables around us to hear clearly. I'm withdrawing my bid. While I appreciate the arts, I wouldn't want to drain the already depleted finances of a family currently facing court-ordered eviction. I'd hate to see them lose a house worth nearly $4 million over an ill-timed, non-essential purchase of a painting they demonstrably can't afford. Mrs. Reed, congratulations on the new acquisition. I hope the pleasure of victory is worth the massive storage unit fee. The room went silent, a vast, terrible void of judgment. Eviction. $4 million. The phrase hung in the air, poisoning the prestige of the evening and destroying the Reed family's carefully crafted facade. Everyone from Richard Thompson to their longtime social rival Mrs. Henderson heard it and understood the implication. The Reeds were ruined, and the architect of their ruin was the daughter they had scorned. Carol had just purchased a $150,000 painting she couldn't pay for moments after her own daughter publicly confirmed they were being thrown out of their house. Carol let out a choked sound, a strangled mix of rage and humiliation, and burst into tears, storming out of the ballroom, James stumbling pathetically after her. The night and their social standing was utterly ruined, reduced to society gossip and whispered speculation. That was the moment of full public reckoning. The next day, the entire story, the house purchase, the eviction, the auction drama, and the rumors of the IRS investigation was discreetly leaked through Mark Sullivan's connections to a reputable Chicago society blog and a local business journal. The narrative I ensured was shared was not daughter cruelly evicts parents, but savvy financial analyst uses forensic skill to recover assets stolen by her family's decades of fraud and favoritism, exposing corporate malfeasance in the process. The public sentiment turned in my favor, as people love a good revenge story, especially when it involves justice served to the arrogant, entitled elite. But the final, most satisfying blow was yet to come. It involved Sarah's carefully constructed influencer brand. Sarah, always the dramatic, delicate spirit, responded to the family crisis by leaning into her victimhood. She posted a tearful, highly produced video on her Instagram titled "The Crushing Cost of Toxic Family Expectations and Jealousy," where she vaguely described being persecuted by a powerful, jealous relative who was vindictive and obsessed with destroying the family's happiness. She cried about the loss of her sanctuary, the Chicago house, and pleaded for donations and sympathetic comments. The video went viral, gaining millions of views and thousands of sympathetic comments from her devoted followers who knew nothing of the fraud. I watched the video with Emma in my temporary office, a beautifully renovated minimalist space in the guest house where I was now truly comfortable. "She's good. I'll give her that," Emma conceded, sipping her custom-blended green juice. Pity is a powerful currency in the attention economy. She's effectively running a micro-fundraising campaign off your actions. "It's a lie, though," I countered, my voice hardening. "She's using the trauma she and her parents caused to gain financial support. We need to expose the true fraudulent cost of their expectations and her alleged lifestyle." I didn't want to just counter her narrative. I wanted to dismantle her platform's credibility entirely. Sarah's brand, Sarah's Simple Luxuries, was built on a foundation of trust, aspirational lifestyle, and curated authenticity. I decided to introduce the public to the real financial source of those luxuries. I went live on my Emerald Holdings LinkedIn account, a platform usually reserved for highly technical finance discussions and institutional investors, with a scheduled public interview titled "The Economics of Interfamily Asset Stripping," a case study in corporate malfeasance and lifestyle brand funding. I didn't name Sarah mom or dad directly. I simply presented the cold, unassailable facts. I used the financial documents I had collected, the transfers from Refab Tech to Golden Willow Group, the details of the fraudulent mortgage, and the specific amounts of money diverted to the lifestyle brand for product testing and content creation. My credibility as a former Ethel Capital executive lent immediate weight to the presentation. My presentation was delivered in a calm, analytical tone, using dry, devastating terms like capital misappropriation, inter-entity transfers designed to evade tax liability, and misrepresentation of income as business expense. I showed anonymized but clearly sourced screenshots of Sarah's bank statements, which I legally obtained during the property transfer discovery phase as the funds were commingled with the trust's accounts, highlighting a $50,000 payment for a travel allowance for a trip Sarah claimed was paid for by a sponsor. I compared the travel allowance to the outstanding debt on Refab Tech's ledger that had caused the business to fail. This case study demonstrates the inherent risks in funding a personal lifestyle brand using corporate assets, I concluded, looking directly into the camera with the focus of a surgeon. The perceived authenticity of a simple luxury lifestyle is entirely contingent on the ethical sourcing of the capital that funds it. When family loyalty is used to shield financial dishonesty, the strong are forced to carry the weak. The costs of maintaining the illusion of a perfect, luxurious life are ultimately borne by those who sacrifice their own future for the benefit of the family's facade. The true simplicity of luxury is not in the product. It's in the clear conscience of the one who paid for it honestly and legally. The impact was immediate and devastating. Sarah's major sponsors, major American retailers and lifestyle brands that value their public integrity above all else, ran for the hills, issuing press releases confirming they were pausing their relationship with the influencer. Her tearful video was deleted. Her followers, realizing they had been manipulated by a trust fund baby who was funding her life through her father's fraudulent business, turned on her with merciless social media fury. Sarah's Simple Luxuries collapsed entirely within 48 hours, leaving her not just broke, but publicly disgraced, her carefully constructed digital empire reduced to rubble. The entire family was reeling. They had lost the house, the business which was now being fully liquidated by my firm, with minimal residual value, their social standing, and Sarah's only source of income and validation. The final scene of their complete downfall took place 2 days later at Mark Sullivan's sleek, modern law office overlooking Lake Michigan in downtown Chicago. We were there to sign the final liquidation documents for Reed Fabtech and the formal, unchallengeable deed transfer for the house. Mom, Dad, and Sarah sat on one side of the vast mahogany table, looking deflated, miserable, and utterly defeated. Again, the custom-tailored clothing they wore only highlighted their recent rapid descent. I sat on the other, flanked by Mark Sullivan and Linda Chen, a powerful visual representation of the legal and financial fortress I had constructed. The atmosphere was thick with resentment and the cold scent of finality. "Amelia, you have won," Dad whispered, his hands trembling as he gripped the armrests of his chair. He looked a decade older than he had on Thanksgiving. "You've taken everything. We have nothing left. Why don't you just call off the IRS investigation? We can sign a non-disclosure agreement. We can leave the state forever. Just please stop this." I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt not just vengeance but a profound aching pity for the hollowed-out shell of the man who had traded his integrity for his wife's approval and his favorite daughter's affection. "It was never about winning, Dad," I said quietly, pushing the stack of liquidation documents toward him for his final signature. "It was about justice, control, and setting the record straight. You taught me the value of money by forcing me to earn every penny while you funded a lie. You taught me the value of power by showing me what happens when you don't have it. You and Mom stripped me of my past, but you also gave me the exact blueprint for my future success. The IRS investigation is now a federal matter and is entirely out of my hands. Your own poor choices dictated that outcome. But I will allow you to stay in the house for 2 more weeks rent-free to finalize your move and find transitional housing. That's an act of grace you never showed me." I paused and slid a single document across the table. It was a check, a certified bank draft made out to James Reed. "This is a certified check for $50,000. I explained, my voice devoid of emotion. "It's severance pay from Reed Fabtech, the amount you are legally due for your final services to the company. It represents the last clean transfer of capital from a business you destroyed. It's also the last time you will ever receive $1 from my hand or from any entity I control. Use it to rent a small apartment in Nashville or wherever Sarah thinks her delicate spirit can recover. You and Mom need to learn what it means to be truly self-sufficient, just like you always wanted me to be. You get to finally experience the American dream of starting from scratch." They were stunned into absolute silence. It was the ultimate final act of control. Not just taking everything, but giving them the bare minimum to survive entirely on my terms and with a clear, demoralizing invoice attached. I signed the last document, closed my briefcase, and stood up. "This meeting is concluded. I wish you all the best. I hope you find the peace you denied me for 30 years. Mark will be in touch with Mr. Peterson regarding the final logistics." I left the office and walked into the bright, cold Chicago sunshine. The air felt fresh, and the city, a place where I once felt like a small, insignificant cog, now felt like an open opportunity, a testament to my own hard-won power. The journey of vengeance was over, the debt paid, the family ties severed beyond repair. The closure was absolute. The weeks that followed were a blur of intense corporate activity, liquidation, and the vigorous construction of my new permanent life. Emerald Holdings wasn't just a shell company for revenge anymore. It was now a thriving, ethical venture capital firm specializing in high-potential women-led startups in the tech and finance sectors. I was using the resources I acquired and the reputation for being financially formidable to elevate others who truly deserved the help. I championed women who had been overlooked, underfunded, and dismissed by the old guard, the kind of women my mother and sister would have casually crushed. I became known in the industry not just for my keen financial mind and ability to find hidden value, but for my fierce, uncompromising integrity. Emma Johnson, my invaluable mentor and partner, officially moved her base of operations to the U.S., and we established our corporate headquarters in a stunning high-rise in Miami, Florida, a place that symbolized sunshine, energy, new beginnings, and most importantly, distance from the cold, toxic drama of Chicago. We ran the company with a philosophy of radical transparency, the opposite of the Reed family's modus operandi. My self-reconstruction was immediate and exhilarating. I poured my energy into Emerald Holdings using the same ruthless intelligence I had applied to my family's downfall to elevate others. I finally pursued the life I had always deserved. I purchased a breathtaking penthouse overlooking South Beach, a place of light and openness, a stark contrast to the dark, emotionally suffocating house of my childhood. I sold the Chicago house, 4,125 Cedar Lane, 3 months later, netting a handsome, clean profit. I used the money to start a substantial philanthropic fund in Chicago dedicated to providing full scholarships and living stipends to high-achieving, low-income students. Students who, like me, would never have to hear a parent say they couldn't afford their education. It was my final positive and enduring act of vengeance against the system of entitlement and inequity my parents had upheld. My parents and Sarah moved to a small, nondescript apartment complex in suburban Tampa, Florida, far from the Chicago social scene. I heard through Linda, who kept an ear out for any major developments, that James had taken a low-level consulting job, Carol had faded into relative obscurity, and Sarah was working as a waitress. Her influencer dreams shattered and her reputation permanently tainted by the public exposé. They had been forced to confront the harsh reality of the American working life, a reality they had shielded themselves from for decades. I didn't hate them anymore. I didn't even think about them often. They had become irrelevant, a closed, uninteresting chapter in a very long, successful book. The true resolution came 6 months after the final confrontation during a casual celebratory evening with Emma in Miami. We were sitting on the immense balcony of my penthouse apartment overlooking the moonlit Atlantic, drinking expensive chilled Sancerre and discussing a potential 8-figure merger deal. "You know, Amy," Emma said, swirling the ice in her glass and gazing out at the endless water. "When you first came to me with the idea to dismantle your family's entire financial structure, I thought it was just going to be a nasty little real estate skirmish, a quick win. I backed you because the numbers were airtight. Not for the drama. But what you actually did was turn decades of emotional pain into pure, focused, strategic ambition. You didn't just win. You built something real and lasting out of the wreckage. You rebuilt yourself from a place of deep injury into a position of unassailable power." I smiled, feeling the warmth of the Florida evening on my skin, a deep sense of peace settling over me. They thought they had broken me by making me pay my own way. They thought my student debt was a failure. They thought I would always be the needy daughter begging for crumbs. But that debt, Emma, was my training. That pressure, that constant dismissal that was my corporate apprenticeship in financial brutality. They handed me the tools. I just decided to use them on the people who had them coming. And you got the last laugh in certified cash with a fully auditable paper trail. Emma agreed, raising her glass. To Emerald Holdings. And to justice. I clinked my glass against hers. I thought back to that Thanksgiving dinner, to Michael's smug face and Mom's vicious demand to lie. They wanted me to be pathetic. They wanted me to be dependent. They wanted me to live under their thumb. Now I was the one pulling the strings, directing capital and shaping futures. I had the money, the power, and the control. I had stood up for myself not with tears or pleas, but with a perfectly executed, devastating financial strategy. I had navigated the turbulent waters of my family's treachery and emerged not just intact, but exponentially stronger. I looked out at the ocean, vast and limitless, symbolizing the future I now had. My life was no longer defined by the cold, confined suburbs of Chicago or the suffocating expectations of the Reed family. It was defined by the open horizon, the ceaseless hum of ambition, and the absolute certainty that I would never again let anyone else write the terms of my existence. I had taken my shot, rebuilt my life in spectacular fashion, and that was the American dream, beautifully and ruthlessly achieved by the daughter who was told to be silent. I was Amelia Reed, and I was finally irrevocably free.